The conflict rages on around them as Crash Wallheim struggles to draw air into his lungs. His physical body is completely broken and covered in bizarre, shimmering markings. A piercing voice rings out from behind him, screaming that he is a useless letdown and demanding to know why he is motionless. Honestly, the sheer audacity of this team is a masterclass in toxic workplace culture. Sigrun stands just a few paces away, glaring at him with pure hatred while she examines the injuries on a wounded Arthur. She completely overlooks the agony that Crash is experiencing right now. Her only concern is forcing him to hurry up and siphon away the lethal hex that is currently destroying their commander. Talk about a terrible boss. He has pushed past his absolute physical limits, spitting up crimson fluid as he forces his fractured skeleton to keep dragging forward. He understands that his remaining moments are fleeting, but he extends an open palm regardless, prepared to execute the single fatal task that justifies his entire existence. The young warrior contemplates his life as the designated sacrificial goat of the adventuring group. Seriously, if your job description includes absorbing pure venom for ungrateful coworkers, it is time to call HR. He has spent his entire life absorbing the decay and venom of the people around him, and it appears his final breath will be no different. Crash gazes down at his own hand, which is decorated with complex markings that label him as a failure from a highly respected bloodline. He has been utilized as nothing more than a human disposal unit his whole life, valued only for his capacity to extract the suffering of others. An onlooker watches with a wide, stunned expression as the dark essence begins to spiral entirely out of control. This observer has witnessed him perform this act 1,000 times before, yet there is a terrifyingly frantic quality to the energy swirling around his fingertips on this day. He shouts out the name of his ability, Black Hood, and a massive torrent of pure darkness bursts forth from his palm. The dark energy glides across the frozen soil like an intelligent predator, eager to feed on the malevolent hexes it was summoned to drain. The waves of darkness rush right past the women, causing their expressions to warp with sudden panic as the turbulent force brushes against them. Suddenly, everyone is nervous when the quiet guy actually does his job. They are accustomed to him silently soaking up their injuries, not unleashing an aggressive power that feels capable of consuming the entire area. The Black Hood ability is typically deployed to siphon away lethal hexes, locking the venom safely inside the body of Crash to keep his companions out of danger. It is a completely unappreciated, fatal role that has left him with far more trauma in his mind than accolades on his uniform. Our central character is technically a member of the prestigious Blue Sky generation, the chosen protectors assigned to halt the ultimate doom of the planet. However, while his companions receive all the adoration, he is left with fluid filling his lungs and rot spreading through his circulatory system. The division of labor here is mathematically ridiculous. On one side of the clearing, Crash falls completely to his knees, vomiting blood after concluding the extraction of the dark hex. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, the women of the adventuring group gather closely around the celebrated champion, Arthur. Abila practically sobbing as she begs him to consume a recovery draft, her voice shaking violently with panic as she watches their leader lose his footing. The champion looks upward with a completely blank, unbothered expression despite the fluid dripping directly from his jawline. He is supposed to be the glowing savior of mankind, yet in this exact moment he appears just as vulnerable as the shattered landscape surrounding them. A terrifying entity known as the Blue Knight of Death abruptly materializes in the clouds, steering a horrifying winged predator. Talk about terrible timing. This guy always knows how to ruin a dramatic moment. It is a literal omen of doom, and its sheer arrival causes the chilly atmosphere to drop to absolute freezing temperatures. The monster's exposed skull illuminates with an unnatural blue radiance as it glares down at its targets. It is a manifestation of horror birthed from the environmental collapse, and it appears fully prepared to execute what remains of the fabled protectors. A violent blast violently shakes the entire territory, launching massive pieces of stone and ice high into the dark sky. The force of the impact is so aggressive that it feels as though the actual earth is tearing apart under the weight of the monster's arrival. Arthur observes the devastation with a completely hollow look on his face. He whispers quietly under his breath that they stand absolutely no chance against this foe. Great leadership skills, Arthur. Just throw in the towel immediately. He questions whether they can actually claim victory in this conflict with the tiny group of survivors they have left, particularly since every single person is already gravely injured. His beautifully decorated blade drops into the snowdrift with a dull clatter, abandoned as though it has suddenly transformed into a worthless piece of scrap metal. He mutters that the situation is utterly hopeless, the finality of their imminent slaughter completely taking hold of his mind. The fair-haired commander rapidly forces himself out of his shock and summons his 3 followers directly to his side. He commands Sigrun, Abila, and Mary to gather around him immediately, his vocal tone dropping into a deep, intense register. They attach themselves to him with complete fanaticism, viewing their leader as the single stable anchor remaining in the center of a chaotic tempest. Seriously, the absolute delusion of this harem is mind-boggling. They possess absolutely no inkling that their beloved leader is on the verge of making a decision that will abandon them all in the freezing cold. Crash observes the entire interaction from a distance, gripping his torso as he fights to maintain his grip on consciousness. He is completely shut out from their tight-knit circle, a throwaway instrument that fulfilled its purpose and is now left to decay in the dirt. He glares intently at the gathering, wondering what exactly Arthur is trying to pull. The man is simply lounging there while an apocalyptic predator draws closer, and the sight causes the skin of Crash to crawl with intense skepticism. Arthur announces that he is bringing everything to a conclusion right now, his eyes turning completely frigid and unyielding. There is an absolute finality in his delivery that indicates he is not discussing winning the war, but rather something far more self-serving. The young man drops completely to his knees as the immense weight of his grim reality thoroughly crushes his resolve. The final remnant of hope for the world is officially extinguished, and there stands their grand protector, shamelessly uttering nothing but disgusting statements of total capitulation. As the leader completely gives up on the struggle, Crash grinds his teeth together, his face twisting with absolute fury and irritation at the decision Arthur made. He realizes that their celebrated protector is simply abandoning this realm, opting to flee rather than endure the outcomes of their collective defeat. What a massive coward. The group turns and begins to stride away, leaving behind a literal ocean of slaughter in the freezing terrain. Crash shouts out to ask if they are truly going to throw away everything after a multitude of individuals died just to guide them to this ultimate war zone. Crash releases a dark, mocking laugh as he screams after their retreating figures, insulting the sheer hubris of the commander. He mocks Arthur for throwing away their entire journey, especially since the man spent the entire mission being coddled by a personal collection of infatuated women. Honestly, someone had to say it, and Crash delivered that truth bomb perfectly. Sigrun loses her temper completely and shrieks at him to close his mouth, her facial features contorting with raw malice. She absolutely refuses to listen to a worthless piece of trash insult the leader she completely worships. Even as they make adjustments to leave him behind, the royal daughter crosses her arms and speaks up for Arthur, asserting that he has put forth his absolute greatest effort for the sake of the kingdom. She is technically classified as a protector of the elite group, but her internal moral compass is completely obscured by her fanaticism. She doubles down on her cruel remarks, labeling Crash as a useless piece of debris who only understands how to steal from others. She warns him never to presume to lecture a noble champion like Arthur, completely ignoring everything Crash has personally given up for them. The level of cognitive dissonance here deserves an award. Crash is genuinely astounded by her sheer audacity, his functioning eye widening with absolute astonishment. To be labeled as garbage by the very individuals whose lives he personally rescued countless times is nearly more excruciating than the physical trauma on his flesh. He aims a shaking, crimson-coated finger in their direction, his voice elevating in sheer fury. He demands to know how they can possibly hurl such malicious accusations at the exact individual who acted as their personal bulwark for multiple years. Our main character motions aggressively toward the surrounding ruins, reminding them that they would not have even managed to survive the initial month of their journey without his specific capability. He was the individual who absorbed the damage so they could continue pretending to be glamorous saviors. He begins to hack violently once more, but he adamantly refuses to remain silent until he has explicitly detailed every single sacrifice they have deliberately chosen to wipe from their memories. It is time for a reality check, and Crash is about to read them their rights. He resolves to initiate his breakdown with Abila, the crimson sorceress of the adventuring party. Abila looks back at him with a weeping, miserable expression, squeezing her magical staff as though she is the individual being mistreated. Cry me a river, Abila. She is supposed to be a highly capable spellcaster, yet her appreciation for his assistance is completely non-existent. She was previously struck by a malevolent hex that entirely stripped away her vocal cords, rendering it completely impossible for her to cast incantations or even utter a word. She was an absolute burden, nothing more than dead weight to the group until Crash intervened to internalize the hex within his own body. The young woman actually physically assaulted him when he attempted to retrieve pain medication for her, striking out like a cornered beast while he was still agonizing from the exact same venom he absorbed on her behalf. Talk about biting the hand that feeds you. He internalized her torment, and her retaliation was an attempt to end his life. He remarks that during that period, and even in this exact moment, her habit of dismissing the heavy tolls paid by others remains completely unaltered. She is perfectly content to utilize him as a waste bin for her dilemmas, yet she refuses to even look directly at his face. She turns her head away, fluid cascading down her cheeks as though she is the casualty of some awful mistreatment. It is the exact same predictable narrative, as she would much rather portray the helpless maiden than confess that she breathes today because of a thief. Next on his list is Mary Diana of Fania, the warrior celebrated as the most powerful lance user in the Empire. She stands in position with a hard, critical gaze, obviously viewing herself as far superior to the man who has been managing her blunders for years. The warrior woman was nothing more than an unthinking simpleton who sprinted directly into every obvious snare, falling victim to every single malevolent hex available. Seriously, her tactical awareness is absolutely subterranean. She would sob and scream for Crash to rescue her every single time she managed to get herself trapped in over her head. Crash runs a hand over his face, his fingertips stopping near the empty socket he surrendered on her behalf. He reminds the royal daughter that she identifies him as human debris now, yet he was the person who gave up his own vision specifically so she could preserve hers. The princess merely observes him with detached, uninterested eyes, completely unaffected by the reality that he surrendered a physical piece of himself for her benefit. He demands to know if she possesses any conceptual understanding of what it felt to agonize for her sake. But her blank look indicates his ultimate sacrifice was merely an instrument performing its required task. In a sudden mental transition back to their schooling days, Sigrun of Fania stands directly above Crash with a drawn blade, her face radiating pure hubris. She selected him as a target specifically because his lineage belonged to the opposing kingdom group, utilizing political warfare as a justification for her relentless sadism. Classic high school bully behavior. Crash is crumpled on the stone floor, enduring strike after strike while his peers mock his condition. They laugh at his complete vulnerability, labeling him a pathetic failure who cannot even muster the willpower to retaliate against his tormentors. The nearby students whisper quietly behind his back, openly debating whether he is truly a legitimate member of the highly respected Wallheim lineage. They mockingly question whether he is simply a fraud who managed to infiltrate the prestigious academy using a celebrated family title. Despite the continuous physical mistreatment, Crash reminds himself that he tolerated the entire ordeal for a highly specific purpose. He was the sole individual who surrendered everything to restore Sigrun's eyesight, an immense obligation that she has explicitly chosen to completely block out. Sigrun looks back at him with a frozen, arrogant smirk as she remembers his initial induction into the elite group. During that period, they informed him that his presence was vital to rescue mankind from doom. However, the actual truth of the matter was far more predatory. In the current era, the main character is a thoroughly shattered individual, clutching his blood-soaked face as he listens to their cruel insults. He was never viewed as a true companion in their eyes, merely a permanent stain on the realm and a failure possessing zero capability for authentic warfare. He looks upward with a completely lifeless expression, his face covered in grime and dark fluid. After multiple years of managing their blunders and internalizing their hexes, he is left questioning what the purpose of all that immense torment was even for. Arthur glares down at his broken form, fluid leaking from his lips as he delivers a freezing analysis of the situation. He informs Crash that if he were any other individual, he might have been celebrated as a global savior. But in his current state, he is nothing more than a massive letdown. The young man bellows the name of Arthur, his voice dripping with pure desperation and absolute chaos. He cannot process the reality that the commander he trusted completely is observing him with such total detachment in their final moments on Earth. He looks back on the days spent trailing behind Arthur, even when it meant guiding other fools directly into severe peril. He had invested his absolute trust into this solitary individual, operating under the assumption that they were collaborating toward a tomorrow where every person survived. Crash remembers the exact moment he made the conscious decision to remain by the side of the Protector, witnessing him stand boldly on the front lines of conflict. He completely believed that Arthur was the sole individual capable of guiding the elite group to absolute triumph. Crash demands to know why Arthur is throwing in the towel so easily at the very conclusion of their journey. While the vocal tone of the commander stays unnaturally serene, even as the landscape disintegrates around them, Arthur resolves that the moment has arrived to disclose the massive secret he has been guarding from his most dedicated follower. The fair-haired leader leans closer, fluid draining down his chin as he inflicts the ultimate emotional strike. He states clearly that the current reality is already thoroughly finished, but he has absolutely no intention of perishing alongside it. He declares his ultimate strategy to restart the universe entirely from the very origin point, leaving the current landscape of ruin completely behind. The eyes of Arthur are entirely empty of any remorse as he prepares to desert the exact planet he was legally obligated to defend. This guy plays too many video games. He literally treats reality like a quick save file. The eyes of Crash widen with absolute horror as the true meaning of Arthur's words registers in his brain. The concept of initiating a total restart while every other human being ceases to exist is a level of perfidy he never anticipated, even from this treacherous gathering. Arthur clarifies that this is mathematically not the initial instance where he has observed a reality face complete annihilation. He has navigated this exact loop multiple times before, utilizing his highly classified ability to flee from the consequences of his tactical blunders. He discloses the specific title of his concealed asset, regression. It is an absolute cheat tier capability that permits him to rewind the chronological timeline while preserving his knowledge of future events, effectively granting him limitless opportunities to achieve an ideal outcome. Must be nice to have infinite retries while everyone else gets a permanent game over. The commander notes that since he has successfully acquired an advanced memory transmission method, his 3 female followers will possess the capability to journey backward through time alongside him. They will all preserve their extensive combat proficiency and past recollections, rendering them substantially more powerful in the subsequent chronological timeline. Crash stares outward in absolute horror as the terrifying conclusions of Arthur's strategy settle into his mind. He comprehends that to the celebrated king of heroes, living, breathing people are merely numbers in a massive algorithm designed to maximize their own survival metrics. Arthur dispassionately states that beginning anew with highly proficient combatants increases the overall statistical likelihood of halting the subsequent environmental collapse. In his twisted logic, abandoning the vulnerable segment of the population is simply a cold administrative requirement for the preservation of the species. He explicitly states that he is solely transporting the 3 young women back to the chronological origin point. He possesses absolutely no desire to squander vital energy on any individual incapable of contributing directly to his concept of a flawless victory. Crash appears utterly crushed, his limbs shaking violently as he poses the single inquiry he already fundamentally knows the resolution to. He frantically desires to comprehend where he fits into this upcoming strategy. However, the silence Arthur provides in return is absolutely deafening. The facial expression of Arthur stays completely icy and disconnected, his eyes displaying zero compassion for the individual who literally bled to keep him functional. He views Crash in the exact same manner one would examine a shattered piece of hardware that is no longer worth the expense of repairing. The leader hands down the final judgment, informing Crash that he is simply not required for the upcoming reality. He has concluded that the main character has thoroughly outlived his operational lifespan and is best left to perish in the debris of this current timeline. The young warrior is left completely speechless, his thoughts spinning out of control from the ruthless rejection. It spent multiple years operating under the belief that they were dedicated brothers in arms, only to discover he was never even considered a metric in Arthur's long-term equations. Arthur confesses that the Black Hood capability Crash possessed was actually remarkably beneficial for a significant duration of time. It permitted the adventuring group to bypass highly potent hexes that would have stopped any regular champion dead in their tracks. He looks back on how Crash was capable of siphoning away hexes that were otherwise completely impossible to unravel, acting as an absolute meat shield for the collective gathering. However, to an individual like Arthur, those immense personal sacrifices were merely a convenient utility service that has now officially reached its expiration date. Arthur highlights the reality that traveling backward through time with an individual whose physical shell and psychological state are already completely ruined makes absolutely no logical sense. He would much rather leave the broken iteration of Crash right here to rot and initiate a fresh start with a pristine iteration in the subsequent era. The commander openly ridicules the concept of basic camaraderie, proposing that it is vastly more practical to simply acquire a clean, uninjured version of Crash once they successfully journey backward through time. He analyzes his dedicated ally as nothing more than a basic starter item meant to be discarded for an upgrade later on. Imagine treating your best defender like a starter Pokemon you release into the wild. Tears flow continuously down the face of Crash as the absolute truth of his entire life finally settles into his brain. He realizes with absolute clarity that he was never viewed as a companion or a teammate to these individuals. He was merely a disposable asset meant to be fully consumed and subsequently thrown away. Arthur and the women turn their physical frames around and walk away into the distance as the landscape literally begins to detonate around them. He informs Crash not to stress over the situation, giving a firm promise to utilize his abilities in the subsequent life cycle and the one following that. He offers one final sarcastic parting word, stating that they will encounter each other again very shortly. The celebrated champion steps directly into the radiant glow of his chronological reversal ability, leaving his most dedicated follower behind to be thoroughly consumed by the literal apocalypse. Crash attempts to call out after them, his voice reduced to a frail, raspy whisper as he witnesses them completely desert him. He begs them to halt their stride, but the protectors do not even reduce their speed as they march directly toward their fresh horizon. He extends a blood-smeared hand toward their departing shadows, the full devastation of Arthur's betrayal finally penetrating his consciousness. Deep within his soul, he confesses that he always understood this exact day would eventually arrive, yet he consciously chose to disregard the reality until it was far too late. In a sudden recollection of his early youth, Crash remembers the specific instances where he was severely mistreated while Arthur merely stood by and spectated without moving a muscle. He understands clearly now that if Arthur truly categorized him as a genuine companion, he would have stepped into the fray to assist him at least a single time. Back in the present era, his absolute despair transforms into blinding, white-hot malice as he screeches at them to drag him along. He brands Arthur an absolute degenerate, his internal fury finally spilling over as the apocalyptic inferno closes in tightly on his physical position. The young man's hand shakes violently in the snowdrift as his sight begins to turn blurry and his conscious mind begins to slip away. He can feel the icy cold invading his bone marrow, an explicit indication that his shattered physical shell is finally surrendering for good. He gazes upward at the fracturing firmament, recognizing with an incredibly dark sense of irony that his own individual existence will conclude before the actual planet does. He is destined to perish entirely alone in the darkness, while the precise individuals who exploited him get to initiate a flawless fresh start without enduring a single consequence. Suddenly, a flash of pure rebellion ignites within his eyes as he completely refuses to let his story conclude in this pathetic manner. He forces his mind to maintain consciousness for one ultimate action. He is completely resolved to either drag Arthur down into the abyss alongside him or discover a hidden path to claw his way back to survival. Crash suddenly realizes that the Black Hood capability is not strictly restricted to the absorption of malevolent hexes. It is engineered to operate effectively on core abilities as well. He has never attempted to deploy it against another champion's primary technique before, but in this exact moment he possesses absolutely nothing left to lose. Time for the ultimate plot twist. He reaches outward one final time, channeling every single remnant of his remaining physical power and pure malice into his open palm. He triggers his unique capability, aiming directly at the very soul of Arthur with the explicit goal of tearing the chronological reversal ability completely away from his body. In a high-stakes, frantic gamble, Crash unleashes his inner power just as the champions prepare to make their final exit. He is a completely broken, expiring human being at the literal bottom of a devastated world. However, he is absolutely resolved to steal the one specific asset that will grant him a future. Arthur is suddenly bathed in a radiant, blinding white illumination as the chronological reversal ability initiates its activation sequence. He stands in place with his limbs extended outward, completely oblivious to the reality that his absolute greatest power is on the verge of being ripped away. The Black Hood capability takes physical form as a massive, monstrous shadow hand descending directly from the upper heavens. Its dark, twisting energy drops rapidly toward Arthur. Its massive visual sensors lock tightly onto the essence of the King of Heroes. Crash gazes upward in absolute bewilderment, his face heavily contorted and covered in blood as the technique successfully establishes its grip. He can barely comprehend the reality that his frantic, desperate longshot is genuinely functioning against an individual as immensely powerful as Arthur. A horrifying, monstrous maw splits open within the swirling vortex of dark energy. Its razor-sharp fangs and elongated tongue stand fully prepared to devour the power. The sheer magnitude of the hijacked ability generates a violent cyclone that physically vibrates the core structures of the expiring planet. Arcane markings and ancient symbols ignite with a radiant glow all along the skin of our main character. As the structural transfer of the ability achieves its absolute zenith, the specific name of the individual who betrayed him rings out clearly in his thoughts, providing endless fuel to the dark sorcery of the Black Hood. Arthur looks downward at the broken young man, his facial features shifting into total bewilderment as he demands to know why Crash has not surrendered to death yet. He still completely fails to grasp the reality that his own cosmic lifeline is being systematically severed by the individual he labeled a throwaway tool. The palms of Crash grip the freezing soil as he directly confronts Arthur regarding his numerous past chronological reversals. He discloses the reality that he knows the champion has witnessed the world perish countless times before, consistently leaving other human beings to freeze while he comfortably escapes. A mental image of an absolute mountain of skeletal remains manifests, representing the dozens of previous timelines where Arthur deliberately abandoned his dedicated allies. Crash contemplates the absolute horror and abandonment he experienced every single time he was left behind to die in a collapsing reality simply because he was no longer deemed operationally useful. With a blood-slicked but completely victorious grin, Crash informs the fair-haired champion that on this day, the cards have been completely redealt. He will be the sole individual to make it out alive, and it is officially Arthur's turn to be thrown away and left behind to rot. Oh, how the tables have turned. Meanwhile, the celebrated leader merely fires back that the young man has completely lost his sanity. Our main character smiles with absolute serenity despite the horrific trauma inflicted on his body. His eyes project a quality of complete and total fulfillment. He has finally accomplished the one specific thing he desired to see with his own eyes, which was the arrogant monarch of champions facing the absolute outcomes of his own perfidy. High above the disintegrating mountain peaks, a skeletal Grim Reaper steering a winged predator drops through a gateway of pure crimson energy. The literal omen of total annihilation has officially arrived to collect the soul of the planet, its massive harvesting blade prepared to reap the life force of those left stranded. The skeletal pilot's empty eye socket radiates a sharp, blinding blue glow as it locks its focus directly onto the war zone. It is an entirely unstoppable phenomenon of nature, representing the absolute termination of the current chronological era. The facial features of Arthur contort into absolute, unadulterated panic as he suddenly realizes he can no longer trigger his cosmic escape route. He is forced to look directly at the reality he consistently sprinted away from, which is the fact that this specific world was genuinely doomed for absolute destruction. Total hysteria floods the fair-haired champion's eyes as the hijacked ability departs his body, leaving him completely exposed and utterly alone. The absolute self-assurance he once radiated has entirely vanished into thin air, replaced by the exact same terror his allies experienced when he left them behind. Karma really is a beautiful thing. Arthur is completely swallowed up by the advancing forces of total destruction. His desperate screams are entirely muffled by the deafening roar of the collapsing universe. Without his core chronological reversal ability, he is merely another nameless casualty of the apocalypse he completely failed to avert. The skeletal entity commands its massive harvesting blade forward, the freezing metal slicing clean through the absolute fabric of space and time. A thunderous voice echoes across the empty void, instructing all those who harbor fear of the grave to battle with every single ounce of strength they possess. A massive column of rotating blue and white illumination bursts into existence around Crash, acting as an absolute shield against the harvesting strike of the Grim Reaper. The hijacked chronological reversal technique is finally executing its activation protocol, violently pulling him out of the collapsing universe and launching him back into the past. As the surrounding reality vanishes entirely into an abyss of pure light, Crash makes a deeply solemn promise to his own soul. He will not merely manage to survive the subsequent reality. He will actively rescue it entirely on his own terms, using the exact capabilities he has successfully stolen. Everything dissolves into an intense, ringing silence as the chronological reversal firmly establishes its hold. The conscious mind of Crash drifts aimlessly through a vast ocean of pure white light. His exhausted eyes finally shut completely as his physical shell is thoroughly reconstructed by the power of the skill. Droplets of sweat roll down the forehead of our main character as he starts to move from his profound state of rest. The transition backward through the chronological timeline is exceptionally draining, leaving his conscious thoughts in a state of highly disoriented, semi-lucid confusion. Suddenly, his eye flies open, his pupil completely dilating with the sudden trauma of a crisp recollection. He is no longer resting on a frozen, bloody war zone, but rather somewhere incredibly cozy and far too recognizable. He snaps upright in his bed with a terrified shout, his hand extending rapidly toward an intricate light fixture dangling directly above him. He is panting heavily for oxygen, the phantom sensations of his previous fatal injuries still reverberating inside his nervous system. The eyes of Crash are completely clear and perfectly vibrant, entirely free of the crimson fluid and battlefield dirt that had covered them mere moments ago. He blinks rapidly in sheer confusion, attempting to logically connect this opulent bedchamber with the literal living hell he was just inhabiting. He surveys the extraordinarily lavish bedroom setup, noting the bright morning light pouring directly through the massive glass panels. The absolute realization starts to settle into his mind as he completely identifies the high-end furniture and the specific architectural layout of the environment. He bounds directly out of the bedding, staring down at his miniature, completely unblemished hands and touching his incredibly young face. He comprehends with a massive wave of shock that he has returned entirely to the residence he inhabited when he was merely a young child. A magical interface window suddenly materializes directly in his line of sight, verifying the completely impossible reality of his current situation. He has successfully completed a chronological reversal back to his 13-year-old self, a specific era existing well before the complete collapse of his lineage and the initiation of his own personal torment. The core system verifies that the chronological migration is officially finalized. Crash gazes blankly into the open room, completely stunned by how incredibly young he appears and the mind-blowing second opportunity at life he has successfully hijacked for himself. Time to rewrite history. The entire planet is literally disintegrating at the seams, being systematically ingested by an alternate cosmic plane of existence. This massive interdimensional catastrophe is recognized globally as world erosion. The moment the local environment begins to violently shift, these aggressive erosion entities start flooding through from the opposing side of the rift. They are mathematically not typical wild beasts. They are highly aggressive conquerors intent on dominating what remains of civilization. The absolute most lethal threats among their ranks are the specific variants that look almost identical to human beings. Hidden right beneath those familiar human physical traits rests a far more sinister reality. These high-ranking directors of the interdimensional raid are officially designated as world eroders. They exert absolute command over the lower-level beasts, effectively transforming an environmental disaster into an all-out war for global survival. Innocent civilians scream in panic and scatter in all directions as gargantuan monsters stampede directly through the central municipal square. Royal defenders are mobilized immediately, but they are barely managing to maintain the defensive perimeter. Then there are the elite individuals who stand directly at the absolute vanguard of the pandemonium. These select few fighters possess the actual raw power required to physically repel the ongoing environmental collapse. A magical staff radiates with blistering heat, channeling pure waves of fire to completely vaporize the advancing cluster of monsters. This is the exact manifestation of power that the average citizen can only ever dream of wielding. The conflict is currently operating at maximum intensity. Refined steel clashes aggressively against thick monster hide as the champions plunge headfirst into the chaotic melee. The actual atmosphere above them appears to be visibly splintering apart at the seams. This specific gathering of fabled combatants is recognized throughout the land as the generation of the azure sky. They represent mankind's absolute final defense against total non-existence. And then there is Crash Wallheim, lingering silently in the darkness right behind the glamorous, glowing champions. He was technically categorized as a legitimate component of the unit, yet his daily assignment was an absolute universe away from being glamorous. Seriously, his role was basically a glorified cosmic garbage disposal. Possessing a physical shell that was structurally incapable of doing anything other than internalizing and locking away hexes, Crash spent his entire existence agonizing for the benefit of the group. He vomited crimson fluid following every single combat engagement, barely holding his physical frame together by a thread. He was systematically treated as a literal living lightning rod, absorbing every single hostile attack so his companions could remain completely flawless. In the absolute end, they did not merely exploit his unique utility, they actively betrayed his trust. It was a completely miserable, agonizing existence that ultimately reached its conclusion in a frozen, desolate terrain. However, right as the absolute darkness began to claim his sight, Crash executed one final, desperate maneuver. Suddenly, the freezing atmosphere completely vanishes. The eyes of Crash fly open as he violently gasps for air. His heart is pounding aggressively against his ribcage like a panicked animal trapped inside an enclosure. He bounds upright in a mattress that feels completely absurdly plush and gazes around the environment in a highly disoriented state. The bedchamber is heavily decorated with pure gold accents and premium polished woodwork, all bathed in stunning, warm daylight. This is mathematically not the apocalyptic war zone. He runs his fingers across the high-end sheets, surveying the opulent environment of a residence he has not laid eyes on in multiple years. Just a mere fraction of a second ago, he was actively dying in the dead of a brutal winter, completely saturated in blood and agonizing hexes. Now it is a midsummer afternoon, so intensely warm that he is already starting to perspire. Talk about a dramatic climate shift. He instantly identifies this specific location. This is Azure Pine Manor, the exact estate where he resided when he was merely a young child. He stares down at his miniature, completely unscarred palms in absolute bewilderment. Vivid recollections of his final high-stakes gamble race through his conscious thoughts. He had actively deployed his unique Black Hood capability against Arthur, the celebrated king of heroes, at the exact split second of the planet's structural breakdown. It actually succeeded. He genuinely managed to tear the chronological reversal ability directly out of the Savior's soul and secure it for his own personal use. Honestly, you love to see it. Crash releases a fragile, uneven chuckle, squeezing his skull with both hands as the absolute reality of his current situation finally registers. He has genuinely traveled backward through the chronological timeline. He brushes his hair backward, still actively struggling to comprehend the reality that his mind is currently housed inside a 10-year-old physical form. The intricate tattoos and agonizing hexes that once completely coated his skin have entirely vanished without a trace. He seats himself directly on the hardwood floor, leaning his back against the bed frame as he begins to logically break down the operational mechanics of what just transpired. Hijacking a capability of that elite caliber should have been mathematically impossible under normal conditions. The Black Hood is an incredibly intimidating asset, frequently viewed by scholars as a power that can simply seize whatever it desires without facing any structural blowback. However, Crash understands the reality far better than anyone else. The technique possesses an exceptionally specific and highly complex obstacle that normally renders high-tier Grand Theft completely unfeasible. Every single time the capability is triggered, it automatically produces a metaphysical padlock that the caster is forced to manually crack. If you lack the capacity to shatter that specific seal, you are completely unable to claim the target ability. The overall structural complexity of that metaphysical lock is determined entirely by the exact degree to which the current owner values the targeted item. Even a completely ordinary stone becomes absolutely impossible to hijack if the possessor considers it deeply valuable. If a young child genuinely treasures a basic pebble, the specific unlocking metric might transform into something completely absurd, such as transferring 99% of the entire world's liquid wealth to her. Naturally, assets that are genuinely powerful, such as god-tier capabilities, should be exponentially more challenging to hijack. They typically manifest with intricate metaphysical locks that absolutely no regular thief can hope to pick. Crash places a finger on his chin, completely lost in intense analytical thought. By all known metrics, Arthur's unique chronological reversal technique should have generated the most sophisticated, unbreakable lock in human history. He envisions Arthur, the celebrated king of heroes, who consistently appeared so incredibly stoic and perfectly composed in front of the general populace. Yet when Crash triggered the Black Hood capability back then, there was absolutely no padlock generated whatsoever. The elite skill simply glided directly into his palms as though it had been actively waiting for his arrival. There is only one logical explanation for a phenomenon like that. If there was not even a fundamental low-level padlock generated, it explicitly indicates that the owner did not value the capability in the absolute slightest. Arthur actually wanted to get rid of the chronological reversal skill. He did not analyze it as a grand blessing or a magnificent asset. He analyzed it as an absolute, unending nightmare. Honestly, who can blame him? Imagine being stuck on the same impossible level for eternity. Looking back on their journey, Crash vividly recalls witnessing the champion standing over massive mountains of slaughtered monsters with a facial expression of absolute, pure exhaustion. Arthur was celebrated as mankind's ultimate savior, but he was executing that role for the countless, mind-numbing time. He was no longer an inspired champion. He was merely a tired worker completing boring daily chores. He operated with a completely hollow facial expression, wiping out massive legions of hostiles as though he were simply finishing a mountain of tedious homework assignments. Crash suddenly realizes that enduring the exact same collapsing reality over and over again completely by yourself would eventually shatter the mental sanity of any living being. To an individual like Arthur, possessing the capacity to rewind the chronological timeline was no longer a grand miracle. It was an absolute prison sentence that kept him permanently trapped in an infinite cycle of global destruction. He had fully engineered a strategy to transmit his core recollections over to his 3 preferred female companions so they could all regress collectively and attempt the mission once more. In that idealized visualization, Arthur and the young women were a perfectly content family unit, and Crash was absolutely nowhere to be found in the equation. He was being deliberately left behind to perish alone in the discarded timeline. A completely freezing expression settles over the facial features of Crash. The explicit reality that he hijacked the technique with such absolute ease proves that Arthur was utterly desperate to discard the asset. And now, Crash is going to deploy that exact asset to systematically collect every single debt he is owed. Get your popcorn ready because the revenge arc starts now. Crash looks down at his miniature hands, comprehending that in the specific chronological timeline he just departed, the King of Heroes is now completely devoid of power. Arthur has officially lost his chronological reversal asset and is currently stranded inside a collapsing universe that is already disintegrating into absolute nothingness. Colossal planetary debris from the Blue Night of Death rains down aggressively on the terrain, entirely erasing everything in its trajectory. For a human being trapped in that environment without a cosmic escape route, it is an absolute guarantee of death. Back in the safety of his childhood bedroom, Crash stands up on his feet and brushes the dust off his clothing. He successfully claimed the exact technique that Arthur was desperate to throw into the garbage. And in his personal estimation, the celebrated champion should actually be offering him profound gratitude for the emotional relief. A dark, cynical smirk crosses the lips of the young boy as he giggles quietly to himself. The absolute irony of the entire scenario is certainly not lost on his mind. He looks back on how things used to operate, standing completely alone under the illumination of the full moon, while the remainder of the adventuring group treated him like an unwanted stray. They consistently advanced forward, leaving him completely alone to manage the toxic aftermath of their battles. He looks back on the absolute agony of internalizing their lethal hexes, his vocal cords literally fracturing from his screaming while they simply stood nearby and watched the show. They functioned under the assumption that his intense personal sacrifice was merely something any common individual could and should perform. He spent his entire previous existence suffering on the hard ground, completely disregarded by the very brothers in arms he was actively protecting with his life. They did not give a single damn about his physical condition as long as their own path forward stayed completely unobstructed. The vivid recollection of blood and dark fluid dripping continuously from his chin is still exceptionally fresh in his mind. It serves as a highly bitter reminder of the exact personal price he paid for their unearned glory. "It serves you exactly right," he whispers quietly, his eyes narrowing with a completely frigid level of intensity. He categorizes those individuals as nothing more than pieces of human debris that he has finally completely outgrown. Prior to stepping outside his room, Crash halts his stride directly in front of a mirror mounted in the grand corridor of Azure Pine Manor. He fundamentally requires a clear look at exactly what assets he has to work with in this fresh life cycle. His reflection displays a young boy of approximately 10 years of age, short in stature, yet surprisingly well-conditioned for his demographic. He can already clearly identify the physical outcomes of the brutal, unrelenting training routine he forced his body through. For multiple years, he swung a heavy blade every single day, completely desperate to secure a legitimate position within the Wallheim lineage. They represent the absolute most powerful martial household in the entire kingdom, and physical weakness is legally not tolerated under their roof. Talk about a strict parenting style. He directs his gaze out the glass panel at the Grand Manor landscape, precisely calculating exactly where he currently sits in the chronological timeline. This specific period is shortly following the formal proving ceremony he attended when he was merely 10 years old. The grand ceremony represents the absolute most critical milestone for any child bearing the Wallheim name, a massive public theater where children demonstrate their physical power and value to the lineage. It is the exact moment where their entire lifelong trajectory is permanently established. Everything ultimately comes down to the divine contract. The more naturally gifted the child happens to be, the higher the overall tier of the deity that steps forward to offer them a blessing. The primary bloodline of the household was consistently expected to secure the absolute best of the best among the gods. However, Crash was the absolute glaring anomaly to the established rule. Forced to kneel on the freezing stone floor while the massive audience spectated with disappointment. He was brought into the world with absolute zero martial capacity or physical gift, so not a single deity stepped forward to claim him. The logistical fallout was instantaneous. Household servants immediately started packing up cardboard containers and loading them onto transport wagons as he was officially expelled from the primary residence. Talk about being kicked to the curb. He was no longer considered a point of pride for the lineage, merely an embarrassing stain to be quietly concealed from the public. He was transported directly to the entrance of Azure Pine Manor, a highly isolated estate where all of the family's failures are permanently sent to live out their remaining existences in total isolation. He looks upward at the massive architectural layout, a permanent monument to his previous public humiliation. He rests his frame against the window border, looking out at the vibrant landscape while an incredibly heavy thought occupies his mind. Out of every single living soul currently occupying this planet, he is the solitary individual who understands precisely how every single event is ultimately destined to conclude. He looks downward at a local water feature where a line of ants are scurrying rapidly along the perimeter of some leaves, completely unaware of the deep water resting right below them. It is a completely basic environmental scene, yet it perfectly mirrors the current state of the human race. The insects battle and drown as the ripples move around them, entirely unable to alter the grand forces of nature. Even the fabled champions of his past existence could not halt the unavoidable termination of the world when it ultimately arrived. Crash looks out into the far distance, his facial reflection visible in the glass pane as he questions his own functional capacity. He openly wonders if he genuinely possesses what it takes to halt the planet from disintegrating into nothingness. He visualizes the memory of the blood-red, monster-packed firmament of the looming apocalypse and the absolute slaughter that lies in wait for every living thing. It is an incredibly frightening vision of a tomorrow that he has already personally navigated through once before. His hand starts to shake slightly, but he rapidly squeezes it into a powerful fist to steady his nerves. He instructs his own mind never to complain or permit fear to control his actions. Analyzing his small feat and the phantom recollections of blood staining the stone streets, he understands that his core incentive is exceptionally straightforward. It is fundamentally not a matter of whether he possesses the ability to halt the collapse. It is the simple reality that he absolutely has to. If the universe is demolished a second time, he will perish right alongside it, and he has absolutely zero intention of permitting that outcome to occur. He remembers the sensation of thick fluid matting his hair and the heavy aura of death. A wild, almost unhinged grin expands across his facial features as he resolves to violently alter his destiny. There exists absolutely no alternate path. He has to transform into the precise individual who steers the universe away from absolute oblivion. The distinct sound of leather shoes striking firmly against the stone flooring resonates through the long hallway, snapping his focus back to reality. Someone is actively drawing closer to his bedchamber. A tall senior butler dressed in a premium formal uniform stops in his tracks and executes a deep bow, resting his palm directly over his heart. He welcomes the young boy with a serene, well-practiced demeanor that appears entirely authentic. Aroto, Cross states out loud, genuinely startled to see the older man alive and functional. At this specific intersection of time, the butler looks down at him with a highly compassionate look, inquiring about what he is currently doing. This specific man is the solitary servant assigned by the main house to manage Cross at this isolated estate. He appears to be an incredibly gentle, grandfatherly entity who genuinely cares for the cast-off failure of the lineage. On the surface layer of reality, Arioto functioned as the absolute perfect protector who remained by his side when every other individual deserted him. However, Cross understands the pitch-black truth concealed right behind that welcoming facade. A dense, suffocating dark energy appeared to visually swirl around the butler's face as Cross stared directly into his pupils. He remembered with absolute clarity that it was Arioto himself who, complying with the explicit instructions of his older siblings, had executed a lethal move against him. The eyes of Cross widen with a freezing level of intensity as he gasses directly at the caretaker he once trusted with his life. Arioto is the primary mastermind who manipulated him into consuming lethal poison when he was merely 14 years of age, providing him with his very first lesson in absolute betrayal. Seriously, you can't trust anyone in this family. Hey. Charlotte is a literal hurricane of polished steel, dismantling fully protected knights as though they are nothing more than basic wooden training targets. With one ultimate definitive strike, she sends yet another challenger crashing violently down onto the stadium floor. While the onlookers spectate in absolute bewilderment, the individuals occupying the viewing areas are completely stunned by her martial capacity. Whispering quietly among themselves about how she is merely 15 years of age and already completely outmatching long-serving combat veterans. This specific individual is Charlotte Wallheim, the household's designated genetic miracle who has successfully acquired the legendary title of Sword Saint well before even entering adulthood. Honestly, her talent is absolutely ridiculous compared to everyone else. Every single person in attendance is singing her praises, labeling her a once-in-a-generation phenomenon who will undoubtedly guide the Wallheim lineage to absolute historical glory. However, while the massive crowd celebrates her performance, Barack Wallheim sits silently in the dark corners of the arena, his hands balled into tight fists as he stews in pure, unadulterated jealousy. His eyes are completely saturated with a malevolent, freezing motivation. He has firmly resolved that if he lacks the capacity to transform into the most radiant star in the sky, he will simply have to extinguish the competition entirely. This guy is the definition of a salty hater. An associate identifies his highly intense facial expression and inquires if everything is functioning appropriately. However, Barack is operating far too deeply within the planning phases of his subsequent maneuver to offer a single damn. To permanently lock down his personal trajectory to the absolute summit of power, Barack concludes that he needs to initiate his plan by completely wiping out the household's absolute greatest failure. He summons Arioto, the dedicated family caretaker, and prepares to present him with a financial proposition that is structurally impossible to walk away from. Barack understands perfectly well that the senior butler is currently battling extreme financial ruin and managing a critically ill daughter, so he deliberately manipulates those desperation-fueled anxieties. He slides a small container of lethal poison directly across the wooden table surface, guaranteeing that Arioto's economic burdens and domestic tragedies will completely disappear into thin air if he simply terminates Crash. Talk about a low blow, exploiting a man's dying child. Arioto is completely torn down the middle. He has personally raised Crash since he was a tiny infant and genuinely cherishes the young boy as though he were his very own biological offspring. Barack does not give a single damn about his internal emotional conflict. Looking entirely uninterested by the senior caretaker's ethical crisis, he explicitly forces Arioto to select an option: either shield a child that does not even carry his genetic material or rescue the actual life of his very own biological daughter. The butler's absolute silence communicates everything. He has been violently cornered into an environment where there are absolutely zero positive resolutions available. In the chronological timeline existing prior to his reversal, this exact strategy functioned flawlessly, and crimson fluid ultimately painted the pristine floors of the estate. A hand trembled violently as the lethal toxin executed its internal assignment, the immense weight of the ultimate betrayal starting to settle in far too late. A youthful Crash could only spectate in pure horror as the man who functioned practically as a father figure to him suddenly dropped to the floor. Arioto had ultimately surrendered to the immense outside leverage, but the internal remorse was so thoroughly devastating that he ended up ending his own existence right after the deed was finalized. Even with his absolute final breath, the senior caretaker extended a hand toward the young master he had just poisoned, offering frantic apologies through the mixture of blood and weeping. His palm eventually went completely limp, leaving the young master entirely alone in a dead silent room saturated with nothing but absolute regret. That was the exceptionally grim conclusion for Arioto in his initial life cycle. A human being who completely shattered his own heart attempting to rescue his biological daughter, he opted to depart this world entirely rather than exist alongside the memory of the poisoned meal he had deliberately served. Jumping forward to the current era, Crash is actively confronting the senior caretaker with a degree of psychological intensity that should be structurally impossible for a child of his demographic. He possesses full knowledge regarding the poison vial Barack provided him, and he is not the slightest bit hesitant about asking Arioto exactly what he intends to execute with it. The shock value here is incredible. Arioto attempts to brush the entire matter off as a basic misunderstanding, but Crash terminates that attempt instantly by explicitly bringing up the butler's ailing daughter. The elderly man freezes entirely in his tracks, realizing with a shock that his secret leverage is no longer a secret at all. Crash releases a lengthy, exhausted sigh, recognizing that he is essentially backing the unfortunate individual into a corner all over again. Mirroring the exact actions of his older sibling, he instructs Arioto to terminate the ridiculous performance. If the butler is simply going to continue pretending to be completely ignorant, there is absolutely no purpose in continuing the dialogue. Arioto is genuinely astounded by the interaction. He fully anticipated the young child to be furious, weeping, or internalizing the blame for the looming betrayal. Instead, he is looking directly at an iteration of the young master that appears significantly older, vastly colder, and far more lethal. Crash instructs him to stop stressing over the past events and simply fall into line behind him, charting the course forward with absolute, unwavering self-assurance. They walk directly into the estate's gargantuan reading room, a completely silent sanctuary packed with enough literature to effectively conceal 1,000 dark secrets. They halt their stride directly in front of an entirely normal-appearing stone wall, and Arioto simply cannot comprehend why they have traveled to this specific location. Crash points his finger at a highly precise section of the masonry and delivers an instruction that sounds completely illogical. Slice it completely open. He deliberately pokes at the senior caretaker's professional dignity, demanding to know if a premier servant of the Wallheim lineage possesses the capacity to manage such a straightforward objective. Arioto does not squander another single moment with pointless inquiries. Stepping forward with the absolute concentration of a professional who recognizes his core obligation, he unsheaths his blade with absolute blinding velocity. A vibrant blue energy field flares aggressively all around the steel as he prepares to execute the strike. His hand stays perfectly stable as he channels his internal power directly into the weapon handle, fully prepared to demonstrate why he is vastly more than a basic domestic servant. The butler actually has some serious skills hidden under that suit. A deafening sonic slash slices through the air, completely disintegrating the heavy masonry with mind-boggling architectural precision. The surrounding dust cloud dissipates to expose a fully concealed corridor. It is an absolutely flawless incision, uncovering the pathway to the household's long-lost historical secrets. Arioto simply cannot believe his own visual sensors. He never would have guessed a hidden structural pathway was neatly tucked away inside a common environment like this. Crash walks directly into the opening, serving up a basic well done to the completely frozen butler. Arioto follows directly behind his heels, staring at the young boy's back with a profound mixture of sheer reverence and utter confusion. To his mind, it is as though Crash has transformed into a completely separate human being compared to the fragile young master he interacted with just 24 hours ago. He observes Crash's single-minded expression and wonders if the child has been deliberately masking this dark side of himself until this exact moment. The absolute vibe surrounding his physical frame is immensely heavy with a raw presence that Arioto cannot quite logically identify. They stop directly in front of a gargantuan wooden portal, heavily fortified with thick iron reinforcing bars and massive chains that have been locked tight for multiple centuries. Arioto experiences a sudden wave of goosebumps, remarking that the young master's current energy field weirdly brings to mind the supreme head of the clan. Crash does not even bother to turn his head around, telling Arioto to stop dwelling constantly on historical memories and simply keep moving forward. He is entirely concentrated on what rests ahead of them, and he refuses to permit anyone's nostalgic thoughts to reduce his operational speed. A sudden mental image of a completely catastrophic inferno flashes rapidly through his mind. A traumatic memory extracted from his prior existence, where absolutely everything was converted into ash and bone. He is standing here right now to guarantee that history lacks the capacity to repeat its blunders this time around. He extends his arm and places his hand directly on the massive metal lock. A profound sense of relief washes over his psychology as he confirms he successfully arrived at this location well before the grand disaster could strike. His overall timing is absolutely flawless, and every single variable is falling into position precisely as he engineered. Arioto, maintaining his role as the completely dedicated servant, volunteers to draw his own weapon and attempt to chop through the heavy chains as well. However, Crash halts his movement, explaining to the caretaker that these are explicitly not the variety of locking mechanisms that a standard sword can simply bypass through physical force. He understands perfectly well that he must manage this specific segment of the operation entirely by himself. The moment has arrived to determine exactly how much of his historical power level he can successfully manipulate inside this miniature physical container. He inhales a deep breath, concentrating his internal energy for a highly serious evaluation of his current capability. He triggers his unique Black Hood asset, and a thoroughly terrifying monstrous shadow hand outfitted with razor-sharp fangs and a massive rolling tongue emerges directly from the darkness. It is an absolutely repulsive spectacle that would easily turn the stomach of any ordinary observer. Seriously, it looks like something straight out of a horror movie. However, to an individual like Crash, it is merely a highly familiar piece of equipment. The pitch-black, jagged shadows generated by the capability accelerate forward like aggressive vipers, winding themselves tightly around the metal linkages in the gargantuan locking mechanism. They initiate an aggressive sequence of pulling and tearing at the reinforced metal with an absolute display of supernatural power. With an echoing, metallic fracture, the gargantuan lock is violently ripped clean away from the wooden portal, launching the heavy chains rattling down onto the stone floor. As Arioto releases a shout of pure, unadulterated shock, the senior caretaker is seen stumbling backward in a panic, his hands elevated in front of him as he struggles to comprehend the scene. Look at the old man losing his cool. Crash smoothly intercepts the heavy lock as it plummets through the air, noting to himself that his physical execution remains completely as accurate as ever, and his operational capabilities have certainly not decayed. Arioto can do nothing but stare blankly, shivering violently as he demands to know if the young child has somehow executed a covert arrangement with an ancient god. Crash contemplates to himself the reality that in this current chronological timeline, he has mathematically not finalized an official arrangement with any celestial entity yet. He recognizes exactly how highly alarming this display appears to an outsider, so he must fabricate a highly plausible falsehood on the spot. He turns his torso back around with a perfectly frosty, unbothered facial expression, informing Arioto that he merely settled an agreement with some completely minor, nameless deity. He openly dares the senior butler, stating that if he desires to report the existence of this hidden archive directly to the supreme leader of the household, he is completely welcome to attempt it, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Arioto is thoroughly immobilized by the absolute magnitude of that chilling gaze, his thoughts spinning out of control as he attempts to merge the sweet child he raised with the terrifying entity standing right in front of him. He is completely unable to locate the vocabulary required to reply, capable only of spectating in absolute stunned silence. The senior caretaker watches Crash march ahead into the dark, reflecting on how just yesterday the young boy's eyes appeared as though they had completely abandoned all internal hope. Now those exact same visual organs are blazing with a frighteningly distinct sense of ultimate destination. He is completely sold on the theory that the divine arrangement with a deity has thoroughly overhauled the young master over the course of a single night, equipping him with a physical power and a psychological drive that was absolutely absent beforehand. Crash is completely, single-mindedly resolved to seize whatever specific capabilities he requires to survive the impending apocalypse. He reminds his own mind that he carries the exact same genetic material as Charlotte Wallheim, the absolute greatest prodigy the Wallheim lineage has ever produced. Even if he is structurally not a naturally born marvel like her, he is going to ascend to the absolute summit of martial arts in his very own unique manner. Watch out, Charlotte, your little brother is catching up. Arioto can only swallow heavily, drops of sweat accumulating on his forehead as he physically registers the colossal psychological weight emanating from the young boy. He understands far better than to interrogate his lord at this current juncture, even if his internal organs are racing with sheer panic. He ultimately manages to locate his vocal capacity, shouting out to the young master with an uneven but deeply deferential tone. He fundamentally requires making his personal allegiance crystal clear if they are going to advance this partnership further. Arioto executes a profound bow, positioning a palm firmly over his heart as a permanent indicator of absolute fidelity and total secrecy. He takes a solemn oath that he will not communicate a single word regarding what is transpiring in this room to any living soul, at minimum until whatever master plan Crash is engineering is completely finalized. Crash looks down at the senior citizen, a brief shadow of something resembling deep melancholy or profound regret intersecting his face for a mere split second. He is beginning to fully register the true operational weight of his chronological reversal and the massive ripple outcomes his current movements are exerting on the environment. Because he is intentionally opting for a completely alternate trajectory on this occasion, Arioto is actively transforming right alongside his master, transitioning into something vastly more than a simple instrument for his older brother's corporate operations. The senior butler's core fidelity is visibly mutating, and Crash can physically feel the chronological timeline splitting apart. For a brief moment, he is deeply haunted by the vivid recollection of the specific iteration of Arioto who successfully poisoned him in his previous life cycle. The exact man who offered him a lethal draft and subsequently perished in absolute agony. That specific ghost remains permanently active inside his thoughts, functioning as a continuous warning of what will transpire if his execution falters. He openly wonders if Arthur, the King of Heroes, surrendered this unique chronological reversal capability specifically because he was deeply tormented by these exact varieties of historical timeline deviations. It is an incredibly heavy philosophical thought that stays anchored in his mind as they advance deeper into the structural layout of the library. He analyzes Arioto, concluding that if he can successfully eliminate the illness plaguing the butler's daughter, he will effectively cement the old man's absolute allegiance for the remainder of his life. It is an exceptionally calculating, cold assessment, but in a brutal reality like this, he understands he must be the sole individual manipulating the structural puppet strings. Loyalty is nice, but leverage is permanent. He recognizes that he fundamentally requires increasing the overall volume of functional pawns under his direct command if he intends to make it through the approaching environmental tempest. Every single companion he secures represents an additional defensive stratum for himself and his personal tomorrow. He instructs Arioto to execute whatever tasks he desires for the immediate duration, dismissing any immediate procedural worries. He gives a firm promise that he will dedicate thought to the medical blueprint for the caretaker's daughter down the road, However, for the immediate present, they have serious labor to execute. The gargantuan archive entry points groan loudly as they ultimately rotate open, exposing a pitch-black, cavernous environment that has been carefully concealed from mankind for multiple generations. This specific destination represents his absolute primary objective, the literal matrix of the power level he has been tracking down since his regression. As the grand doors separate, a radiant, blinding violet illumination pours out directly from the absolute center of the grand chamber, lighting up the tiny dust fragments suspended in the stagnant atmosphere. It is an exceptionally eerie, supernatural radiance that registers as both profoundly ancient and incredibly hazardous. The eyes of Crash expand significantly as he absorbs the visual scenery, his respiration stopping inside his throat for a brief fraction of a second. He has ultimately uncovered the exact asset he was hunting for, and the absolute reality of the object is significantly more intense than his memories indicated. A gargantuan column of pure, unadulterated energy bursts upward toward the upper ceiling, swirling aggressively with color spectrums that appear to completely contradict the established laws of the natural world. Immense power vibrating outward from the source is absolutely massive, causing the literal atmosphere around their bodies to shake with extreme supernatural voltage. A massive, highly self-assured grin spreads wide across the face of Crash as he comprehends that his high-stakes gamble has officially paid off. He can physically feel the radiating energy calling out directly to his soul, a firm guarantee of the exact physical power he has been deeply yearning for since the absolute second he traveled back in time. He can physically feel the interdimensional erosion hexes actively crawling all across his flesh, a physical sensation that would easily manipulate a standard human being into absolute insanity from pure terror. However, to an individual with his background, it is merely an explicit confirmation that he is occupying the correct space, standing directly where his highly classified instruction manual is concealed. They survey row after row of massive wooden bookshelves, many of them completely coated in dense spiderwebs and thick strata of historical dust. Somewhere hidden among these thousands of completely erased literary volumes rests the absolute solution to his personal survival. He monitors the gold-leafed titles with a highly trained eye until he ultimately identifies the single specific book he has been tracking down. He extends a hand forward, a massive sensation of complete victory washing over his psychology as his fingers make contact with the damaged leather spine of the book. This is the legendary hidden archive of the Blue Pine Pavilion, a specific geographic location that has not hosted a single human guest in far more years than any local scholar can compute. It preserves the strictly prohibited data of the Wallheim lineage, intentionally maintained far away from any outside investigative eyes. These ancient pages explicitly document the highly specific combat methodologies and core recollections of the Wallheim predecessors who were publicly branded as absolute failures by the remainder of the clan. They were gentlemen and women who lacked the capacity to depend on corporate genetic gifts and were forced to battle aggressively for every tiny shred of power they obtained. These are mathematically not standard capabilities granted automatically by a celestial deity. They represent the direct outcomes of human plasma, heavy perspiration. Hey, the show is about to get intense now. If you watch up to this length, you are a real supporter of the channel. Big appreciation. If you want me to continue next chapters, comment next below, like and subscribe. Thanks.